Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Penn Vicarage on this cold but lovely Tuesday morning. Thank you for joining us, and good to be with you today as we continue our adventure through the Psalms. Friends, we are in Psalm 30 this morning, and I think without further ado, we'll get straight into it. So here goes, Psalm 30. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and did not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you his faithful ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, his favour is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favour, O Lord, you've established me as a strong mountain. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear me, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You've taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give you thanks forevermore. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Psalm 30. In a lot of these Psalms, these David Psalms in Book 1, which, as you know, is Psalms 1 to 41, the theme kind of goes a bit like this. David's in trouble. He asks for help. God helps him, and there's great rejoicing. So there's that kind of common theme. David's in trouble. He asks for help. God helps him, and there's great rejoicing. That's kind of the three sections. And you get that theme coming through in our psalm for this morning. And you actually get it three times. It's in three sections, this psalm is. There's verses 1 to 3, there's verses 4 to 5, and there's verses 6 to the end of the end, which is 12. And essentially what it goes is this. The first three verses, you get the standard thing. He's thanking God, okay, because he has been in trouble. He has cried to God for help, and God called him out of Sheol, saved him from death, and so on, and from down to the pit, and rescued him. So in 1 to 3, you get the standard thing. He says, I praise you, God, because I was in trouble. I called you for help, and you helped me. That's verses 1 to 3. It's a personal thing. Verses 4 and 5 are what you might call a generic version. If it's happened to David, David's saying it can happen to everyone. So sing praises to the Lord, he says. Everyone should sing praises to the Lord because, you may get anger free or may get difficulties for a short time. But if you call for God, God will help you, and that'll be the same for you as well. So you might say you've got the generic version. So in verses 1 to 3, you get David talking about what's happened to him. In verses 4 and 5, you get what he says will happen to everybody else. So he encourages everyone to praise God because you may get difficulties for a night, but joy comes in the morning, and so on and so on and so on. The rest of it, verses 6 to 12, you might say is a padded version of verses 1 to 3. He gives like the fuller version of how he was helped out of trouble. And essentially what he says is this. He says, before I got into trouble, the problem was, essentially, he says, he essentially became complacent. He says, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favour, O Lord, you'd established me as a strong mountain. So it's essentially saying, I became complacent, I thought in my prosperity, I thought I was absolutely fine. I thought, I'm all right, Jack, I'm doing okay. Nothing could ever happen to me, can it? And therefore what he's saying is essentially complacency set in. And I do think actually complacency is something we need to watch out for in our Christian lives. In churches, we need to make sure that we're not simply doing things the way they've always been done and resting on our laurels. I think there's quite a bit of that in the church often, living, if you like, on inherited grace. It reminds me of the time with Jesus when Jesus comes across some Jewish people we have Abraham for our father, and Jesus says, don't say of Abraham for our father, God can turn these stones into sons of Abraham. I mean, God is so much more powerful. And I think often in church life we do things in a particular way because it's always been done that way, and things worked that way 30 years ago, so I'm sure they're going to work that way today. And we can't try new things because it didn't work last time, so we can't do it again, and so on and so on and so on. And complacency sets into church life as it can so easily do. And of course, it can sit into our personal lives too. It's very important that we keep our faith alive. That was one of the interesting things about the coronavirus pandemic, is it actually forced us to do things that we'd never otherwise do. I never would have been doing talks like this if the coronavirus hadn't come along. We wouldn't have been live streaming our services if it hadn't come along. And it kind of shook us out of our complacency and made us think about new ways of doing things and different ways of doing stuff. And it's really important in our Christian lives, actually, that our lives are lived today, that we shouldn't always be living in some glory years from the past or whatever it may be. God, in his infinite goodness and mercy, has put us in today, in 2022. And we should rejoice in that and live God's life in God's way today, in the time that God has put us. So essentially what David is saying here is that he got into the problem because of complacency. Then he says, you hid your face. I think what this means is that to turn your face towards something means to give it your attention. There's a bit in the Aaronic blessing, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you his peace. And here he says because he got complacency, he said, oh Lord, you hid your face. And when God's face was turned away, he says, I was dismayed. And it's kind of, it's almost like, if you've got God's face, if you've got like God's attention, it's like having an audience with God, if you like. If God turns his face away, it's big trouble, because we need God's presence. And he said, so because of my complacency, you hid your face, oh God. You weren't looking at me anymore. I wasn't in your attention. I wasn't your gaze anymore. And as I say, he contrasts it here with the blessing of Aaron. May he make his face shine upon you and give you his peace. So the problem is he got complacent, and because of this, God, so to speak, hid his face from him. Thirdly, what happens then is that David calls out to God. And it's fascinating, actually, because in his calling out to God here, he's he speaks with great candor, great honesty about where it's at. And basically, he's so desperate to get God's help. Like I say, he's very honest in what he says. And I think it's really important that we do that as well, actually, that we can be honest with God. But it's interesting, actually, that the words David uses, he tries to make it so it's almost like, I'm saying to you, God, it's in your interest to save me. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? So what he's saying is, look, God, it's in your interest to keep me alive, because if I'm dead, I can't praise you anymore. And it's using that kind of language, and he's very, very honest and very blunt with God. He's desperate for God to help him, and he's prepared to use some quite strong language here in order to get God to help him. And then, of course, God does. And this lovely picture, he says, you turned my mourning into dancing. And it's in using the imagery here of changing your clothes. You've taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy instead. And it's a lovely picture. It's almost like taking off grotty old clothes and putting on new clothes instead. You've taken off my sackcloth, what you used to use for mourning and so on, and instead put joy on instead. So here in this psalm, you get the usual pattern of David's in trouble. He asks for help. God helps him, and there's great rejoicing. And you get it 3 times. You get the personal version in verses 1, the abridged personal version in verses 1 to 3. You get the generic version for everybody, in verses 4 and 5. And you get the padded out version in verses 6 to 12. And in verses 6 to 12, you see various things which he sort of unpicks it a bit. He talks about, firstly, his complacency. And the lesson for us is not to be complacent, never to be complacent, never to take God's love for granted, just to rejoice in it. So we should never get complacent. Secondly, you see he was dismayed because he felt as though God had turned his face. He was no longer in God's attention anymore, and that hurt him. And actually, we need God's presence all the time. It's important that we remember we keep alive with God today, and enjoy therefore God's presence. Thirdly, when he's calling out to God, he's wonderfully honest. He shoots from the hip, and so even trying to make it sound as though it's in God's interest to save it. But it's important that we pray with all our heart. There's no point shilly-shallying, and let's be honest with God. Let's say it the way we see it. In a sense, he knows what we're thinking anyway, so let's say it. And finally, when God does help him, it's great, and he turns David's mourning into dancing. And love the idea of taking off the old clothes and putting on new clothes, taking off sackcloth instead of putting on joy instead. A beautiful psalm. Hope you agree with me. And there'll be another one tomorrow, 31 tomorrow. God bless you. Have a lovely Tuesday. Thank you so much for being with us today, and God bless you, and more tomorrow.